Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Killer on the Night Drive by Will F. Jenkins. Madge was ready to leave the house and in the act of turning out the lights when the telephone rang. She picked it up and Mr. Tabor identified himself. He sounded as if he had a bad cold, although Madge hardly knew him well enough to identify his voice anyway. He said apologetically that he'd heard that Madge, he called her Mrs. Haley of course, was driving over to Colchester tonight. It was an imposition for him to ask, but it would be a great favor if she could take a passenger with her. His niece, Eunice, who was in town for the day for the first time, wanted to go over there to get the train home. Madge felt uncomfortable. When anyone in town mentioned Colchester and the Colchester Road, you felt uncomfortable these days. But to hear Mr. Tabor say it was even more disturbing. "I was just about to leave," Madge said, "but if she can be ready fairly soon, I'll be delighted to take her along." "She's ready now, Mrs. Haley," Mr. Tabor said faintly, as if from far away. "She'll be waiting on the porch. I have to leave, so I'll thank you now on her behalf." He hung up, and Madge turned off the lights and went out to the car, still feeling uneasy. No woman liked to be reminded of what had happened to Mr. Tabor's wife. She'd been murdered while driving alone over the Colchester Road at night. The same thing had happened to another girl, too, but that wasn't quite the same as someone you knew being murdered. Nobody in town knew the other girl, but Madge and Mrs. Tabor were nodding acquaintances in the town supermarket and on Main Street. The car started briskly, and Madge guided it 2 blocks ahead and 1 to the right. Through the gloom, she saw a figure waiting on the steps of Mr. Tabor's unlit house. Madge opened the right-hand door. "You're Eunice?" she called cheerfully. "I'm Mrs. Haley." "It's very good of you," the girl answered in a flat voice. "I hope this doesn't put you out." "Nonsense," said Madge. "I'm glad to have company. Climb in and toss your bag in back." The girl obeyed silently. She was a little bit angular and a little bit clumsy. Her hat was severely plain. She wore spectacles that seemed to Madge to be tinted, although it was hard to tell in the faint glow from the street light up the block. She sat primly, her hands folded in her lap, as Madge turned and headed out of town. Presently the houses grew further apart. Street lights no longer appeared, and on either side of the road, fields stretched out and dark masses of woodland showed beyond them. The road flowed smoothly toward them as Madge settled down for the 40-mile run to Colchester. It was really a beautiful evening. The pungent smells of growing things that rose out of the spring dark made Madge very glad to be young and alive and driving to meet her husband tonight. And at that, Madge was reminded again of Mrs. Tabor. One reason Mrs. Tabor's death had been especially horrible was because she was a bride, and Mr. Tabor had been so happy and so proud of her. "It's nice having someone with me," said Madge. "I really don't like driving at night, but my husband gets into Colchester at 10 tonight, and if he waited for a bus, he wouldn't get home until after 3 in the morning. We have dreadful service here." The girl was silent for a second, then said, "Yes." Madge's ear was caught again by the flat, low-pitched tone of Eunice's voice. It had no human quality at all. Eunice added, as if in apology for being curt, "But it isn't bad in the daytime." "No," Madge agreed. She was silent for a space, then said, "How did Mr. Tabor know I was driving over?" The girl hesitated before she answered. "I guess somebody mentioned it." "Well, they'd hardly—" Then Madge stopped. She realized that although she never would speak of the Colchester road to Mr. Tabor for fear of hurting him, others might not feel the same. "I got the gas and oil and tires checked today. I guess I mentioned it to Bob, the filling station attendant, where I was going. I guess that's the answer." The girl said, "Probably," and sat quietly, her hands in her lap. The road made a sharp bend, and woodland closed in on them. The air was chilly among the trees, and then it warmed again as the woods dropped away, and they were on a clear stretch once more. "Mrs. Haley," the girl said suddenly, "do you carry a pistol when you drive at night?" Madge jumped a little. She laughed, although not quite with ease. "Good heavens, no! Why?" Then she said, "But I suppose your uncle thinks women should." She felt strange. She was going to drive over the highway on which Mrs. Tabor had been killed 12 months before. There had never been any clue to the killer. It was just assumed that somehow Mrs. Tabor, who also had been on her way to meet her husband, had been persuaded to stop her car and pick up someone. The car was found later. It had been sprinkled with gasoline and set on fire, and any clues it might have yielded were destroyed. Mrs. Tabor, meanwhile, had been found bludgeoned to death. There were other details, but that was the way the local paper phrased it. She heard herself saying with morbid interest, "How long had your uncle and Mrs. Tabor been married?" "About 3 months," the girl said. She added in the same expressionless manner, "We're near the turnoff, aren't we?" "Why, yes," said Madge. She grew confused. One doesn't expect a newcomer to know such things. She didn't remember Mr. Tabor's niece ever having visited him before, and she'd more or less assumed that she was a complete stranger. As far as that went, Mr. Tabor wasn't a long-time resident himself. He'd come to town about 1.5 years ago to accept a rather good position, and after 3 months he married and brought his bride to town. Only 3 months after that, Mrs. Tabor had started to drive to Colchester one night, and the murder had occurred. Madge remembered clearly and uncomfortably the first time she'd seen Mr. Tabor after the murder. He was a small man, and he'd looked shrunken and mummy-like by then. But he didn't go away. He stayed on, living in the house in which he'd spent his honeymoon. Madge couldn't understand his doing that. The car came to the turnoff. There was nothing conspicuous about it. It was just a secondary road that branched off the main highway and wound across country to Colchester. In 35 miles, you could see on it only one small country store and maybe 4 or 5 farmhouses set far back from the highway. Most of its length, the road cut straight through heavy woods. Madge turned into it. The air was fragrant with the aromatic smell of pine. It was cooler, too, but one no longer had the feeling of being in open space. Above and ahead, there was a narrow ribbon of sky in which stars shone brightly. The headlights stabbed on and showed pine tree trunks alongside. There was a bare screen of underbrush at the road's edge. The angular figure beside Madge said, "Lonely in here, isn't it?" Madge pressed harder on the accelerator. The car picked up speed. "One thing's certain," she said, trying to smile. "Nobody could make me stop to pick them up on this road." Mrs. Tabor, Aunt Clara, I suppose I should call her, Eunice said, didn't pick up people either, but that night she did. Madge set her lips and drove. Presently she said awkwardly, "Eunice, has Mr. Tabor ever had any idea of who killed Mrs. Tabor?" Eunice said impassively. "There's always the chance that the man who did it will be caught." There was a slight pause. "Another girl was killed 6 months later, you remember." Madge suddenly regretted deeply that she had not made some excuse to avoid riding with Eunice. It was bad to be reminded of Mrs. Tabor, but to be reminded at the same time of that other battered body of an unknown girl made it worse. The police were never able to find out even so much as her name. All that was known was that she had been dead 6 weeks or so when her body was found by some local hunters. "Your uncle," said Madge, "is staying in town then, and in the hope of catching his wife's murderer?" Eunice answered quickly. "The same man killed that other girl. There was a scorched road map under her body when they found it. Apparently she was driving too, only the killer got rid of her car. It's never been found, but obviously it was the same man. The crimes were identical." Madge said, shocked, "But that means—" "That the killer is still around," said the flat voice. "His name was even given to the police, but they didn't believe it for an instant. He's too well thought of." You talk as if you know who the killer is," protested Madge. Eunice said, almost scornfully, "Of course." The car swept past a small field of shoulder-high weeds. Just before the woods enveloped them again, there was a sudden sweetness in the air, honeysuckle. Then the damp, aromatic smell of pine once more. Madge was sensitive to odors. Consciously or otherwise, she associated some scent with everyone she knew, all her friends certainly. Now she suddenly realized one of the things that made this girl Eunice seem strange. She did not use perfume, not even a scented soap. Madge's forehead began to knit into a faint frown. Her heart started pounding oddly, as if in anticipation of something that would occur to her presently. She said uneasily, "Even if Mrs. Tabor's murderer were caught, I can see that it might be hard to convict him now. My husband's a lawyer, and he says the evidence in such cases has to be airtight." The voice beside her said in a detached way, "There was no motive for those particular women to be killed. A jury wants to see a motive for a crime, naturally, preferably a motive they could feel themselves." Madge admitted uncomfortably, "My husband said something like that." She fumbled in the handbag beside her. "You drive," said the flat voice. "I'll light your cigarette." Madge ignored the quick impulse she had to decline. She knew she shouldn't take her eyes off the road when she was driving this fast. She felt a cigarette touch her lips. Then Eunice snapped a lighter. Its tiny flame rose up before Madge's face. She glanced down. The car wavered. Then the wheel resisted, and the car righted itself. The wheel was being held. Madge felt sheer paralysis numb every muscle in her body. "I've got the wheel," Eunice said. Madge remembered to puff. The cigarette was lit and the lighter withdrawn. The wheel was released. Everything was as before. The car went swiftly between the tall tree trunks. There was the same clean smell of damp underbrush and pine. Everything seemed exactly as it was before. But everything was very different. Madge's whole body was cold. Her heart was hammering hysterically. In that one glance down at the flame as it was held to her cigarette, she had seen Eunice's hand closely and clearly lit. The fingernails had no nail polish. Their ends were not rounded, but square, like a man's. The knuckles were like a man's. There were short black hairs on the back of the hand, like a man's. Eunice was a man. A voice inside Madge's brain chattered hysterically. "You aren't sure it was Mr. Tabor on the phone. He talked as if he had a cold. It could have been anybody. It wasn't Mr. Tabor at all. It was somebody who wanted to ride with you." There was a light by the side of the road ahead. Numbed as she was, Madge drove on blindly. She saw other lights, which were windows, and knew dumbly that it was the single store between the cutoff and Colchester. But she was a quarter of a mile beyond it before she realized that she could have stopped there. She could have swerved the car and crashed it against something, and people would have run out, and she would have been safe. But it was too late now. She went on driving. The muscles of her throat were constricted. The car sped through the darkness, its headlights flaring before it, and now and again a moth fluttered helplessly in their rays. Once a pair of eyes glittered by the roadside. As the car sped past, she saw it was a cat, miles from any house, crouching in the grass at the road's edge. "Women really should carry pistols when they drive at night," said the voice beside her. "But maybe they wouldn't have the nerve to use them." Madge made an inarticulate sound. Then an idea came to her. If she could keep him talking... "I doubt that I could shoot anyone," she said. Listening to her own voice, she was astounded. It sounded quite human, almost convincing. "I couldn't imagine harming another human being." Her passenger said quietly, "I don't know that the man who killed Mrs. Tabor and the girl who was never identified could be called human. He possibly couldn't help it. But there used to be stories about werewolves." "Oh, but that's nonsense. People can't turn into wolves," Madge said nervously. "Some people turn into something," said the figure beside her. "Once in a year, or once in 6 months, they feel something stirring in their minds. Their eyes change. They glow. They're bright and restless and terribly intent. They feel unbearable tension. They're obsessed, and they have to kill." Madge expected to hear herself scream, but her voice went on with incredible control. "Then the psychiatrists ought to watch out for the bright-eyed people." "Oh, but people like that are cunning," her passenger said softly. "They don't let anybody notice their eyes." The unbecomingly hatted head turned toward Madge. In the dim light from the instrument panel, the tinted spectacles regarded her in a wholly inhuman way. "You see," Madge's passenger said, "I've studied about them. I wanted to understand, and it seems that there have always been such people. In old days they killed like wolves, and wolves were blamed, so the story of the werewolf began, the story of a person who got into a house in human form and then turned into a wild beast to kill and rend and tear his victim. It was wonderfully clever of the people who kill to start that story." The figure in the seat beside Madge seemed strangely amused. "But I can't believe that." Her passenger sat quite still. The hands were folded primly. Somehow the quiet was more menacing than any muttered threats would have been. Madge's hands and arms didn't tremble because they felt paralyzed, but the wheel rolled a little unsteadily. "I suppose they're frightened after they've killed," her companion went on. "They would be, but they learn cunning. They never live in one place very long. They kill once or twice, or maybe 3 times, and then they move away. But they act like very nice people on the surface, and their friends are sorry to see them go. They never dare to get too prosperous, however. When they're doing well, it would be a temptation to stay on, and then they'd kill maybe a 4th or 5th time in the same place, and that would hardly be wise. Oh, they are cunning. They have to be." The woods thinned for a moment. Far away, a single unwinking dot of light indicated an isolated farmhouse, far from any neighbors. Then the trees closed in once more, and Madge knew that from here to the very outskirts of Colchester there would be no other light. She heard her voice say brightly, "Let's talk of something else. Why choose such a gruesome subject, Eunice?" "Mrs. Tabor was killed somewhere along here," her passenger said softly. Then Madge's hands began to shake. It was not a mere trembling, but an uncontrollable shake. The road was very straight here, and a long way ahead there was a light, a tiny red light. She pressed on the accelerator and found herself praying agonizingly that the man beside her in a woman's dress wouldn't notice the spot of light until she had caught up with it. The man beside her continued quietly, "You had your car checked today, Mrs. Haley. You mentioned at the filling station that you would be driving to meet your husband at the Colchester station. That wasn't discreet. People still talk about Mrs. Tabor's murder. The filling station attendant mentioned that you'd be driving the same way tonight, the same way she did. If the killer heard about it..." Madge was willing now to keep him talking on any subject, even this, until she caught up with whatever that was ahead. "Oh, but I'm sure no one would think..." "Someone would. Someone who was obsessed, who felt unbearable tension inside, someone who knew the time had come when he had to kill." "Why," Madge said with effort, "why, you speak of it as if someone planned to kill me." The figure beside her said softly, "I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised at all." Then the voice changed. "There's something on the road ahead. It looks like an accident." The light was not moving. She overhauled it swiftly. If she could only get to where someone else was, no matter who, then she knew not only what was in the road ahead, but whose lights had been turned up, because she could see who it was. She recognized the red motorcycle on which Bob, the boy from the filling station, dashed about town. It lay there, its lights slanting brightly across the road. There was Bob, limping out into the glare. He had a bandage on one leg. "I've got to stop," Madge said. "I know him. It's Bob from the filling station. He was the one who checked my car today." The figure beside her seemed to relax. A crazy, frantic hope came to Madge. The masquerading man must be armed, but wouldn't he hesitate to try to kill a man and a woman? A woman alone would be a certain victim, but if she could get Bob into the car, the figure that pretended to be Eunice might sit quietly and get out in Colchester, and nothing would happen at all. The brakes squealed shrilly. The car stopped. There was some spilled gasoline on the road, and Bob, limping, almost hopping, in the headlight rays. He came to the window beside Madge. "Mrs. Haley," he said with relief, "I was hoping you'd be coming along behind me instead of having gone on ahead. I hit something in the road and skidded, and my leg's all messed up." He stopped. He'd seen that Madge was not alone. She said unsteadily, "Bob, this is Eunice, Mr. Tabor's niece. She's riding to Colchester with me." "Oh," said Bob. "Get in the back seat," said Madge urgently. "You'll want a doctor. I'll rush you over to Colchester." Bob hesitated. "I don't know. I hate to leave my bike. All I need is somebody to help me get it standing up. With one bum leg, I can't do it, but I don't need much help. It's not too heavy." The quiet voice beside Madge said, "I'll help. I've got a pair of heavy gloves in my suitcase. I'll get them out and help, if you'll pull up a little so we won't block the road, Mrs. Haley." Bob went limping back to his motorcycle to wait. Madge was buoyed by hope. She pulled ahead and over to the side of the road. The man beside her said softly, "Move up a little farther. Don't stop the motor, Mrs. Haley." And then he turned and spoke rapidly, intensely. "Mrs. Haley, I'm really John Tabor. My wife was killed near here by someone she knew. She would never have given a stranger a ride. She'd had her car checked that day at the filling station, just like you did. She was worried about driving alone at night." Madge gasped and tried to speak. "I've been watching everyone who could be a suspect," Mr. Tabor told her. "I finally singled out Bob. I noticed him acting strangely just after my wife's death, and then again 6 months ago. Nothing happened immediately, only then they found that other girl's body, and she'd been dead just 6 weeks. I knew then that I was right, and I became sure of it as I watched. Tonight, he knew you were coming. He said so. You'd have stopped for him, too. You know him, just as my wife did." Mr. Tabor leaned closer. "He thinks I'm a woman. I'll start back, then he'll call to you to stop your motor and help. He's quite sure he'll have both of us for victims tonight." But what shall I do?" Madge was close to tears. "Just drive on," John Tabor said. "That's all. I think he's going to be surprised tonight." The angular figure went back along the highway's edge. Madge sat stiff as a doll at the wheel of the idling car. There was no light except the narrow ribbon of stars overhead and the patch of road lighted by the motorcycle's beam. Bob was silhouetted against the lighted space. He watched the small, skirted figure as it approached him, and as Madge looked, Bob seemed to change. He was a black shape against a lighted background, and the shape changed very gradually from that of a tall young man favoring an injured leg to that of an animal crouched to spring. One of the arms moved slowly, and it came back into silhouette, holding a heavy object. The hand that held it swayed it gently back and forth, making ready. Then Bob spoke. "Mrs. Haley," he called, "if you'll turn off your motor and come help too, it won't be any time at all to get the bike up and going." Madge couldn't force an answer. Then the crouched figure began to move forward with a swift, rolling gait, and it did not limp. The injured leg was a trick. Madge let in the clutch. She never remembered driving those last 10 miles to Colchester. It was her body that did it, taking charge while her mind was filled with a kaleidoscope of terrifying scenes. So this was the way Mrs. Tabor had been killed. She'd stopped at the filling station, as Madge had done, to check her car for the night drive, and she'd chatted with Bob and told him where she was headed. The unknown girl must have been driving through, and she'd stopped for gasoline too and told Bob she planned to drive to Colchester that night. After her body was found, there was still nothing for the police to go on. Mr. Tabor's talk of glittering eyes wasn't enough even to justify an investigation. It wasn't anything at all without evidence, so Mr. Tabor could only wait patiently for that look to come into Bob's eyes again, and then find out what woman would be driving alone and drive with her. Madge drove like the wind until the lights of Colchester showed through the trees. Then she slowed the car and took it sedately into Colchester. She stopped at the town's one red traffic light and parked with trembling precision by the railroad station. Then she sat still, shaking. She couldn't speak. She couldn't tell anyone. For days after that, Madge stayed home, tense and shivering. The first time she went out, she saw Mr. Tabor on the street. He lifted his hat politely and smiled at her. She nodded distantly and hurried on, and shortly after that, he moved to another town.